The carriage wheel cracked against a hidden stone, and Alina Ashworth felt her whole body lurch sideways as the vehicle tipped and groaned on the narrow Highland road. Rain hammered the roof like fists. Her maid, Margaret, screamed as the carriage tilted further, and for one long breath Alina was certain they would roll straight off the cliff edge into the black water below. Then, with a final shudder, the carriage settled hard against a boulder and stopped. Alina sat frozen, her heart slamming against her ribs, her gloved hands gripping the seat so tightly her knuckles ached. Outside, the wind screamed through the pines, and somewhere far off, thunder rolled across the mountains like a warning. "Margaret," she said, forcing her voice steady, "are you hurt?" "No, my lady. But the wheel, I heard it break." Alina closed her eyes for a moment, steadying herself. She had left London only 4 days ago, still dressed in the deep black of mourning, still carrying the weight of a husband 3 years dead and a family who wanted her gone. She had not expected the journey north to be easy. She had not expected it to nearly kill her. The carriage door was wrenched open from outside and rain poured in. The driver, soaked through and pale, leaned in with wild eyes. "My lady, the wheel is shattered. We cannot go on tonight. There is no inn for miles, but I know this land. There is a great house not far from here on the other side of the ridge. It belongs to the Duke." "Which Duke?" Alina asked, though the cold was already creeping into her bones and she cared less about the answer than about shelter. "The Duke of Ardgour, my lady, Duncan Mac Rae's own kin. A hard man, they say, but he will not leave a woman to freeze on his land." Alina did not have the luxury of choice. She wrapped her cloak tighter, took Margaret's arm, and stepped down into the storm. The walk to Ardgour Castle felt endless. The ground was slick with mud, and twice Alina nearly lost her footing on the steep path. Lightning split the sky, and for one bright instant she saw the castle rising ahead of them, a huge, dark shape of stone and turret, its windows glowing faintly like watching eyes. It looked less like a home, and more like a fortress built to keep the world out. By the time they reached the great oak doors, Alina was soaked to the skin and shivering violently. She raised her hand and knocked, though the sound was swallowed by the storm. She knocked again, harder. The door opened, and a tall man stood in the frame, lit from behind by firelight. He wore no coat, only a plain white shirt open at the collar, and his dark hair was pushed back as though he had been running his hands through it in frustration. His eyes, when they found her, were sharp and cold, the color of storm clouds themselves. "Who travels in weather like this?" His voice was deep, edged with a Scottish roughness that seemed to match the land itself. "Forgive the intrusion," Alina said, her teeth chattering despite her effort to sound composed. "Our carriage has broken on the road below. My maid and I have nowhere else to go." For a moment the man simply looked at her, as though weighing whether to believe her, or whether to care. Alina lifted her chin and met his gaze without flinching, though her legs trembled with cold and exhaustion. Something shifted in his expression, not warmth exactly, but a grudging recognition that he could not, in good conscience, leave 2 women outside in a storm like this. "Come in, then," he said at last, stepping aside, "before you catch your death on my doorstep." Alina stepped past him into the entrance hall, and the heat of the fire struck her like a physical thing. She had never in her life been so grateful for warmth. Margaret followed close behind, and the man she still did not know his name for certain, though she suspected, closed the heavy door against the storm with a sound like a closing tomb. "I am the Duke of Ardgour," he said, watching her with an unreadable expression. "Alastair Mac Rae, and you are?" "Lady Alina Ashworth," she answered, dropping into as much of a curtsy as her frozen limbs allowed. "Widow of Lord Charles Ashworth. I am traveling to settle matters at Blackmore Hall, which borders your land, I believe." Something flickered across his face at the mention of Blackmore, recognition, perhaps, or something closer to distaste, but he said nothing of it. Instead, he called for a servant, an older woman named Fiona, who appeared almost instantly, as though she had been waiting nearby the whole time. "See that the ladies have dry clothes and a warm room," Alastair said, "and send up food. They'll not be traveling further tonight." Fiona nodded and gestured for Eleanor and Margaret to follow her up a wide stone staircase. Eleanor cast one last glance back at the Duke before she climbed the stairs. He was still standing near the door, watching her with those sharp gray eyes, his expression unreadable, as though he were trying to solve some puzzle he had not asked for. The room Fiona led them to was simple but warm, with a fire already crackling in the hearth, and a large four-poster bed draped in dark green fabric. Eleanor changed into a borrowed gown, plain but clean, and sat by the fire as a tray of bread, cheese, and hot broth was brought to her. "He does not usually allow guests," Fiona said quietly, setting down the tray. "Not since he came back from London. You should feel fortunate, my lady." "Why does he avoid guests?" Eleanor asked, curiosity outweighing caution. Fiona's mouth tightened, as though she had already said more than she meant to. "That is not my story to tell, my lady. Rest now. The storm will not clear until morning." After Fiona left, Eleanor sat alone by the fire, turning the strange encounter over in her mind. The Duke's cold manner did not entirely match the way he had looked at her, as though he were both irritated by her presence and unable to look away from it. She told herself it meant nothing. She was a widow in mourning, bound by every rule of propriety to grieve quietly and remain untouched by scandal. She had no business noticing the sharp line of a stranger's jaw, or the low rumble of his voice, or the strange warmth that had crept into her chest despite the cold. She thought of her husband, Charles, and the 3 long years since his death. She thought of his family, who had summoned her back to London not out of kindness, but out of greed, eager to see her remarried, or better yet, quietly disappeared from their affairs entirely so they could claim what remained of the estate. She thought of the letter in her trunk, the one from her brother-in-law, Lord Whitmore, warning her that if she did not settle matters quickly and quietly, they would find a way to settle them for her. She had come north to escape that pressure, if only for a few weeks. She had not expected to find herself sheltering beneath the roof of a duke with storm-gray eyes and a guarded heart. Sleep did not come easily that night. The wind continued to howl outside, rattling the windows, and somewhere deep in the castle, Eleanor thought she heard footsteps pacing, slow, restless, unable to settle. She wondered if it was the Duke, awake as she was, turning over his own private storms. By morning, the rain had softened to a fine mist, and the world outside her window looked washed clean, the mountains rising green and gray in the early light. Eleanor dressed quickly, eager to see about her carriage and be on her way before she became any further burden to her unexpected host. She found Alasdair in the great hall below, standing near the window with a cup of dark tea in hand, still wearing the same restless expression from the night before. He turned as she entered, and for a brief moment, something almost like surprise crossed his face, as though he had expected her to look different in daylight, smaller perhaps or less certain of herself. "Your carriage cannot be repaired until tomorrow at the earliest," he said without preamble. "My man examined it this morning. The wheel is beyond simple mending, and the roads will be treacherous until the ground dries." Eleanor's stomach tightened. Another day beneath this man's roof in this strange castle was not what she had planned, and yet what choice did she have? "Then I am obliged to impose on your hospitality a while longer," she said carefully. "I promise to be no trouble." Something almost like the ghost of a smile touched his mouth, gone before she could be certain she had seen it at all. "Somehow," Alasdair said, "I doubt that very much." Eleanor did not know whether to be offended or amused. Before she could decide, he turned and walked toward the study, leaving her standing in the great hall with the strange, unsettling sense that her simple journey north had just become something far more complicated than a broken carriage wheel. Outside, the mist continued to lift from the mountains, revealing a land as wild and unpredictable as the man whose castle now sheltered her. And though Eleanor told herself, again and again, that she would leave the moment the roads allowed, some quiet part of her, one she did not entirely trust, was not at all certain she wanted to. Eleanor woke before dawn to the sound of raised voices somewhere below her window, sharp and urgent, carried on the cold morning air. She rose quickly, wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, and moved to the glass just in time to see two men on horseback arguing near the castle gates. One of them was Alasdair, unmistakable even at a distance by his height, and the dark hair whipping loose in the wind. The other man she did not recognize, but his posture was rigid with anger, his gloved hand jabbing toward the castle as though accusing it of something. She could not hear the words, only the tone, and the tone alone told her this was no friendly visit. By the time she dressed and made her way downstairs, the strange rider was gone, and Alasdair stood alone in the courtyard, staring at the empty road with a stillness that unsettled her more than any shouting could have. "Is something wrong?" she asked before she could stop herself. He turned, and for a moment his guarded expression slipped, revealing something raw and tired underneath. Then it closed again, like a door shutting. "Nothing that concerns you," he said, though not unkindly. "Come, Fiona has breakfast waiting." Elinor followed him inside, though the questions lingered in her mind like smoke that would not clear. She had noticed the way the servants exchanged glances whenever the Duke's temper darkened, the way Fiona's voice dropped whenever his past was mentioned. There was a story here, buried beneath the stone walls of Ardger Castle, and Elinor found herself wanting to know it far more than propriety allowed. The morning passed slowly. Word came that the carriage wheel could not be repaired until the following afternoon at the earliest, as the local wheelwright had been delayed by flooding on the southern road. Elinor accepted the news with outward grace, though inwardly she felt a strange flutter of something she refused to name, relief, perhaps, or anticipation, though she could not say for what. She spent the hours exploring the castle's lower rooms, careful not to wander where she was not welcome. The library caught her attention first, its shelves lined floor to ceiling with books in both English and Gaelic, the air thick with the smell of old leather and paper. She ran her fingers along the spines, pausing when she found a collection of poetry, its pages worn soft from frequent reading. "You read poetry, my lady?" She turned, startled, to find Alasdair standing in the doorway, arms crossed, watching her with an expression she could not quite decipher. "When I have the time," she admitted, "though lately time has been in short supply." "Grief has a way of stealing it," he said quietly, and something in his voice told her this was not idle conversation, but something closer to shared understanding. "You speak as though you know," she said, setting the book down carefully. Alasdair was quiet for a long moment, long enough that Elinor thought he might simply walk away without answering. Instead, he crossed the room and picked up the very book she had been holding, turning it over in his hands as though it held some memory he had not touched in years. "My wife loved poetry," he said finally. "She read to me every evening, even when I pretended not to listen." The words landed heavier than Elinor expected. She had not known he had been married. No one had mentioned a wife, and the castle held no obvious sign of one, no portraits, no lingering touches of a woman's hand in the decor. "I am sorry," Elinor said softly. "I did not know." "Few do any more," Alasdair replied. "She died 4 years ago. Fever took her within a week. I was in London at the time, attending business I thought more important than coming home early." His jaw tightened. "I have not forgiven myself for that." Elinor felt something in her chest ache in sympathy, a recognition of grief she understood intimately, though her own loss had come in a different shape entirely. "My husband died at sea," she said, surprising herself with how easily the words came. "A storm much like the one that brought me to your door. I was told the news by a letter, delivered 3 weeks after the fact. I did not even have the chance to say farewell." Alasdair looked at her then with something new in his gray eyes. Not pity, which she would have resented, but understanding, quiet and steady. "Grief makes strange companions of us all," he said. "It does," she agreed. They stood there a moment longer, the silence between them comfortable in a way Elinor had not expected from a man who, only a day before, had seemed as cold and closed as the stone walls surrounding them. The rest of the day passed with small, unplanned moments that Elinor would later realize had begun to shift something between them. He showed her the castle's armory, filled with ancient swords and shields that told stories older than either of them. She told him of Blackmore Hall, of her husband's family and the pressure they placed upon her to remarry quickly, to disappear quietly into some new arrangement that suited their interests rather than her own. "They wish to be rid of me," she admitted over supper, the honesty slipping out before she could catch it. "Not out of cruelty, exactly, simply convenience. A widow without children is an inconvenient loose thread in a family's affairs." "And what do you wish?" Alasdair asked, watching her with unusual attentiveness. The question caught her off guard. No one had asked her that in 3 years, not her husband's family, not her own distant relations, not even herself, if she was honest. She had been so consumed with surviving each day of expectation and obligation that she had forgotten to ask what she actually wanted. "I do not know," she admitted quietly. "I suppose I have not allowed myself to wonder." "Perhaps you should," Alasdair said, "before someone else decides it for you." The words settled into her chest like a small ember, warm and unexpected. She studied him across the table. The sharp lines of his face softened slightly in the candlelight, the guardedness in his eyes not entirely gone, but loosened just slightly in her presence. That evening, unable to sleep, Elinor wandered down to the great hall, drawn by the low crackle of a dying fire. She found Alasdair there, seated in a large chair, a glass of amber liquid in his hand, staring into the flames with the same restless expression she had noticed the night before. "You should be asleep," he said without turning, though there was no real reprimand in his tone. "So should you," she replied, taking a seat near the fire, close enough to feel its warmth, careful to maintain a respectable distance from him. "Sleep does not come easily in this house," he admitted. "Not since," he stopped himself, and Elinor did not push him to finish. Instead, she simply sat with him in comfortable silence, watching the flames dance and shift, feeling, for the first time in 3 long years, something close to peace. It startled her, how easily it came, how naturally her guarded heart seemed to soften in this man's quiet presence. They spoke for hours that night, about small things and large ones, about the mountains and the sea, about books and grief, and the strange, unpredictable turns a life could take. Elinor found herself laughing for the first time in longer than she could remember, a genuine, surprised sound that seemed to startle them both. Alasdair watched her laugh with an expression of quiet wonder, as though he had forgotten such a sound existed, or had forgotten how much he missed hearing it. "You should do that more often," he said quietly. "Laugh?" "Yes." Elinor felt heat rise to her cheeks, unrelated entirely to the fire beside them. "I have not had much reason to lately." "Then perhaps," Alasdair said, his voice low, "you have simply been in the wrong company." The words hung between them, heavier than either had intended, and for a moment neither looked away. Elinor's heart beat faster than propriety allowed, and she reminded herself sharply of who she was, a widow in mourning, bound by every rule of decency to remain untouched by such feelings. And yet, sitting there in the firelight, feeling seen and understood for the first time in years, those rules felt very far away indeed. She rose abruptly, murmuring a good night, and hurried back to her room before she could do something foolish, before the strange warmth blooming in her chest could lead her somewhere she was not yet ready to go. But as she lay in bed that night, staring at the shadows dancing across the ceiling, she knew with quiet certainty that something had shifted between her and the brooding Duke of Ardgour. Something dangerous, something she could not yet name. And somewhere below in the great hall, Alasdair sat alone by the dying fire, turning over the same unsettling realization in his own mind. That for the first time since his wife's death, he had wanted, quite desperately, for someone to stay. The rain returned before dawn, softer this time, a fine mist that clung to the mountains like a veil. Elinor woke to the sound of it tapping against her window, and for a long moment she simply lay still, listening, replaying the conversation from the night before in her mind. She told herself it meant nothing, that a shared understanding of grief was not the same as anything more dangerous, and yet her heart did not seem convinced. She dressed slowly, choosing her words carefully in her mind before she had even left her room, rehearsing how she might greet Alasdair with the proper distance of a guest who intended to leave as soon as her carriage allowed. She would not allow herself to be foolish. She would not allow herself to forget who she was and what waited for her in London. But when she came down to the great hall, she found the castle in an unusual flurry of activity. Servants moved briskly between rooms, carrying linens and polishing silver, and Fiona directed the chaos with the sharp efficiency of someone managing far more than an ordinary morning. "What is happening?" Elinor asked, catching Fiona's arm gently as she passed. "Guests, my lady," Fiona said, slightly breathless. "Lord Grant and his sister arrived this afternoon. The Duke did not expect them, but such visits are rarely refused, not from a man like Lord Grant." Elinor's stomach tightened at the name, though she could not say why. "Who is Lord Grant?" Fiona hesitated, glancing around before lowering her voice. "A neighboring landowner. He has long wished for an alliance with the Duke, through marriage if he could manage it. His sister, Catherine, has set her sights on his grace for some time now." The words landed with an unexpected sting, sharper than Elinor thought reasonable given how little claim she had on Alasdair's affections. She busied herself instead with helping where she could, if only to keep her hands occupied, and her mind from wandering into places it had no business going. Lord Grant arrived precisely as the mist lifted, riding into the courtyard with the confident ease of a man accustomed to being welcomed everywhere he went. He was tall, fair-haired, and handsome in an obvious way, his smile quick and practiced. Beside him rode his sister, Catherine, elegant in deep blue traveling clothes, her dark hair perfectly arranged despite the journey. Elinor watched from a window as Alasdair greeted them in the courtyard below, his manner polite but noticeably stiff, none of the warmth she had witnessed the night before present in his posture now. Catherine, however, seemed entirely undeterred by his coolness, looping her arm through his with practiced familiarity as they walked toward the castle doors. Something twisted uncomfortably in Elinor's chest, an emotion she recognized with startling clarity as jealousy, though she had no right whatsoever to feel it. She was introduced at supper that evening as a guest delayed by carriage troubles, and she watched Catherine's sharp eyes assess her with immediate practiced calculation, taking in her plain borrowed gown, her widow's status, her lack of obvious fortune or connection. "How unfortunate, your carriage breaking down so near Ardgour," Catherine said sweetly, though her tone carried an unmistakable edge. "Though I suppose some might call it fortunate, depending on one's aims." "I assure you, Lady Catherine," Elinor replied evenly, refusing to be baited, "my only aim is reaching Blackmore Hall as quickly as the roads allow." "Of course," Catherine said, though her smile suggested she did not entirely believe it. Throughout supper, Elinor watched Alasdair carefully, noting how he answered Catherine's questions with polite brevity, how his eyes drifted more than once toward Elinor's end of the table, only to be quickly redirected when he caught himself doing so. Lord Grant, meanwhile, spoke at length about hunting, politics, and the advantages of uniting neighboring estates, his meaning unmistakable despite never being stated outright. After supper, the party retired to the drawing-room, where Catherine insisted on playing the pianoforte, her performance skilled and clearly intended to demonstrate her many accomplishments. Elinor sat quietly near the window, watching the rain streak down the glass, feeling suddenly very much like an intruder in a story that was not her own. "You seem distracted, Lady Ashworth." She turned to find Alasdair had crossed the room to stand near her, his voice low enough that the others could not hear over the music. "I am merely tired," she said, though it was only half true. "It has been a long journey." "Catherine's company can be exhausting," he said, a faint wry note in his voice that startled a small, unwilling smile from her. "I did not say that," Elinor replied. "You did not need to." Their eyes met, and for a moment the noise of the room seemed to fade entirely, leaving only the quiet understanding that had grown between them over the past 2 days, an understanding that felt, increasingly, like something neither of them could easily walk away from. "Alasdair," Catherine called from the pianoforte, her voice bright and possessive, "come turn my pages, won't you?" He held Aliner's gaze a moment longer before excusing himself, and Aliner watched him go with a strange, hollow feeling settling in her chest. She reminded herself sharply that she had no claim to jealousy, no right to feel anything at all beyond gratitude for his hospitality. And yet the feeling remained, stubborn and unwelcome. Later that night, unable to sleep, Aliner made her way once more toward the great hall, drawn by habit rather than intention. She found it empty. The fire burned down to embers, and she stood there a moment, disappointed in a way she refused to examine too closely. Looking for someone. She turned sharply to find Alasdair standing near the doorway, having apparently followed her from the drawing room. His expression was unreadable in the dim light, though something in his posture suggested he had been searching for her as much as she, perhaps, had been searching for him. "I could not sleep," Aliner said, which was true enough. "Nor could I." He crossed the room slowly, stopping close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him despite the cooling fire. "Catherine believes I intend to make her an offer," he said quietly. "Her brother certainly believes it. They have believed it for over a year." "And do you?" Aliner asked, hating how much the answer mattered to her. "No," Alasdair said, his voice firm. "I have never given her reason to believe such a thing, though she chooses to believe it regardless. My heart has been closed for 4 years, Aliner. I did not think it capable of opening again." The use of her given name, unadorned by title, sent a small shiver through her. "And now?" she asked softly, though some part of her feared the answer as much as she longed for it. Alasdair reached out gently and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, his touch light as breath. "Now," he said, his voice rough with something she recognized as barely restrained feeling, "I am no longer certain of anything at all." Aliner's heart pounded so loudly she was certain he must hear it. She knew, with absolute clarity, that she should step back, should remind him and herself of every rule of propriety that stood between them. Her mourning, his standing, the guests sleeping just down the hall who would delight in any scandal they could report to London society. But she did not step back. Instead, she remained still, caught in the quiet gravity of his gaze, feeling every rule she had ever followed grow distant and unimportant compared to the simple, undeniable pull she felt toward this guarded, grieving man who had somehow, in only 2 short days, become impossible to ignore. "This is unwise," she whispered, though she made no move to leave. "Yes," Alasdair agreed, his hand still resting gently against her cheek. "Entirely unwise." Neither of them moved away. The fire crackled softly behind them, the only sound in the vast, quiet hall, and Aliner felt the careful walls she had built around her heart over 3 long years of grief and obligation begin, dangerously, to crumble. "Catherine and her brother will be watching," she said, though it sounded more like a plea for him to convince her otherwise than an actual objection. "They are asleep," Alasdair said, "and even if they were not, I find myself, for the first time in a very long while, unable to care what anyone believes." Aliner knew she should leave. She knew every argument against remaining exactly where she stood. And yet, standing there in the dying firelight, feeling truly seen for the first time since her husband's death, she found she could not summon the will to walk away. Instead, she stayed, caught between duty and desire, aware that whatever happened next would change something between them, something that could not easily be undone once it began. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. The fire had burned down to a soft orange glow, casting long shadows across the stone walls, and the silence between them felt heavier than any words could have been. Aliner was acutely aware of everything, the warmth of his hand still lingering near her face, the steady rhythm of her own breathing, the low, distant sound of rain against the windows. "I should return to my room," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. "You should," Alasdair agreed, though he made no move to release the quiet space between them. Aliner searched his face, looking for some sign of hesitation, some flicker of doubt that might give her the strength to walk away. Instead, she found only the same raw honesty she had glimpsed the night before, the same weary longing that mirrored her own. Alasdair, she began, though she did not know what she meant to say next. He closed the remaining distance between them slowly, giving her every opportunity to step back, to end this before it began. She did not take it. When his lips met hers, it was gentle at first, careful, as though he too understood the weight of what they were doing. Elinar's breath caught, and for a moment the world outside the great hall, the guests sleeping down the corridor, the morning clothes still packed in her trunk, the rules that governed every corner of her life, simply ceased to exist. She kissed him back before she could stop herself, one hand rising to rest against his chest, feeling the steady, quickened beat of his heart beneath her palm. The kiss deepened slightly, warm and unhurried, carrying within it 3 years of loneliness on her part and 4 years of guarded grief on his. When they finally parted, both were breathless, and Alinar stepped back sharply, her hand flying to her lips as though she could somehow undo what had just happened. "I should not have," she began. "Alinar," Alasdair said quietly, reaching for her hand before she could retreat further. "No," she said, shaking her head, panic rising swiftly beneath the lingering warmth of the kiss. "This cannot happen. I am in mourning, Alasdair. If anyone learned of this, if Catherine or her brother suspected." "They will not learn of it," Alasdair said firmly. "I would never allow harm to come to you through carelessness." "It is not only carelessness I fear," Alinar said, her voice trembling slightly. "It is—" She stopped, unable to finish the thought aloud, though the truth of it sat heavy in her chest. She feared how quickly, how completely she had allowed herself to want this, to want him. Alasdair studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "Do you regret it?" he asked quietly. Alinar opened her mouth to say yes, to offer the easy lie that would end this dangerous moment and allow them both to retreat to safer ground. But the word would not come. "I do not know," she admitted instead, "and that frightens me more than anything." "It frightens me as well," Alasdair said, his voice rougher than before. "I did not intend for this to happen, Alinar. I have spent 4 years certain I would never feel anything again. And then you arrived at my door in the middle of a storm, and everything I believed about myself seemed to unravel within a matter of hours." Alinar felt her resolve weakening further with every word he spoke, and she forced herself to step back, putting proper distance between them before she could do something even more reckless than the kiss they had already shared. "I must return to my room," she said, her voice barely steady. "Please, Alasdair, do not follow." He did not argue, though the look in his eyes told her the request cost him something. She turned and hurried from the great hall, her heart pounding, her lips still warm from his, and did not stop until she reached the safety of her room and shut the door firmly behind her. She pressed her back against the wood, breathing hard, trying to make sense of what had just happened. 3 years of careful, quiet grief, of following every rule society demanded of a widow, and in the span of 2 days she had allowed a Scottish duke she barely knew to unravel every careful thread of her composure. She should leave in the morning, she told herself firmly. Carriage repaired or not, she would find some way to continue her journey to Blackmore Hall and put proper distance between herself and the dangerous pull she felt toward Alasdair Mac Ray. It was the only sensible course of action, the only way to protect what remained of her reputation and her fragile peace of mind. And yet, even as she made the resolution, some quiet, honest part of her heart knew it would not be so easily done. Sleep did not come easily that night. Alinar lay awake for hours, replaying the kiss again and again in her mind, feeling both guilt and longing war within her in equal measure. She thought of Charles, her late husband, and wondered if she owed him some continued loyalty even now, 3 years after his death. She thought of Alasdair's late wife, and the quiet grief that still lingered in every corner of his castle. She thought of Catherine, sleeping just down the corridor, convinced that Alasdair's future belonged to her. By the time dawn broke, gray and misty over the mountains, Alinar had convinced herself of exactly nothing, except that leaving Ardgur Castle as quickly as possible was now more urgent than ever. She dressed before the household stirred and made her way quietly down to the courtyard, hoping to check on her carriage's progress before facing anyone at breakfast. least of all Alasdair. But she found him already there, standing near the stables, speaking quietly with his steward, Duncan, about the state of the roads. He turned as she approached, and something passed between them, unspoken, heavy with the memory of the night before. "The wheel is nearly repaired," Duncan reported, glancing between them with poorly concealed curiosity. "You should be able to continue your journey by midday, my lady, weather permitting." "That is welcome news," Elinor said, though the words felt hollow even as she spoke them. Alasdair said nothing, though his gaze lingered on her longer than propriety allowed, and Elinor felt the weight of everything left unsaid between them settle heavily over the quiet morning air. Breakfast was a strained affair, Catherine's bright chatter filling the silence that neither Elinor nor Alasdair seemed capable of breaking. Lord Grant spoke at length about returning south within the week, extending an invitation for Alasdair to visit their estate before the season's end, an invitation clearly meant to further Catherine's ambitions. Elinor excused herself as soon as manners allowed, retreating to her room to finish preparing for departure. She had nearly finished when a soft knock sounded at her door. She opened it to find Alasdair standing in the corridor, his expression carefully composed, though his eyes betrayed the same turmoil she felt. "Your carriage will be ready within the hour," he said. "Thank you," Elinor replied, equally formal, though her heart ached with the effort of maintaining such careful distance. Neither moved to end the conversation, and finally Alasdair stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Elinor, whatever happened between us last night, I do not regret it, whatever you may believe, and I will not pretend otherwise, even if propriety demands it of me." "You must," Elinor said softly, "for both our sakes." "Perhaps," he said, "but I will not forget it, and I do not believe you will either." Elinor did not answer, because she knew, with painful certainty, that he was right. Whatever had happened in the great hall the night before had already changed something within her, something she suspected would not easily be undone, no matter how far she traveled from Ardgour Castle, or how quickly she tried to bury the memory beneath the safe, familiar rules of her old life. By the time her carriage finally rolled through the castle gates that afternoon, Elinor allowed herself one last glance back toward the towering stone walls. Alasdair stood in the courtyard, watching her leave, his expression unreadable from such a distance, though something in his posture told her the parting cost him as much as it cost her. She turned away before the tears gathering in her eyes could fall, and the carriage carried her onward toward Blackmore Hall, toward the family and obligations waiting to reclaim her, though her heart, stubbornly, remained behind in the mist-covered mountains of Ardgour. Blackmore Hall greeted Elinor with the same cold formality she remembered from years before, its gray stone walls rising sharp against an overcast sky, its windows dark despite the early afternoon hour. She had barely stepped down from the carriage before her sister-in-law, Margaret Ashworth, appeared on the front steps, her expression tight with disapproval before a single word had been spoken. "You are 3 days later than expected," Margaret said, offering no greeting beyond the accusation. "Lord Whitmore has been most displeased." "My carriage suffered damage on the northern road," Elinor replied evenly, refusing to let the woman's coldness unsettle her further than the past 2 days already had. "I was fortunate to find shelter." "Fortunate indeed," Margaret said, though her tone suggested she found the entire explanation suspicious. "Where did you take shelter exactly?" Elinor hesitated only a fraction of a second before answering. "At Ardgour Castle. The Duke was kind enough to offer his hospitality until the carriage could be repaired." Something flickered across Margaret's face, surprise followed quickly by calculation. The Duke of Ardgour himself, how very interesting. She said nothing further on the matter, though Elinor did not miss the way her sister-in-law's eyes narrowed thoughtfully before she turned and led the way inside. The days that followed settled into a rhythm of tedious meetings and careful negotiations. Lord Whitmore, Elinor's brother-in-law, proved every bit as demanding as his letters had suggested, presenting her with a stack of documents concerning the estate's remaining assets, each one designed, it seemed, to extract whatever final advantage the family could claim before releasing her entirely from their affairs. "You understand, of course," Whitmore said during one particularly long afternoon in his study, "that your continued presence in this family creates certain complications. It would be far simpler for everyone if you were to consider remarriage. There are several gentlemen who have expressed interest, given proper introduction." "I have no wish to remarry," Elinor said firmly, though the memory of Alastair's kiss rose unbidden in her mind, complicating the certainty of her own words. "Wishes are a luxury, Lady Ashworth," Whitmore replied coolly, "one your current situation can scarcely afford." Elinor left the meeting more exhausted than she had felt in months, the weight of the family's expectations pressing down on her with renewed force. She retreated to the small garden behind the hall, one of the few places she had ever found genuine peace within these walls, and sat quietly among the withering autumn roses, allowing herself, for the first time since leaving Ardgur, to think properly about everything that had happened. She had told herself the kiss meant nothing, that it was simply a moment of weakness born from grief and loneliness and the strange intimacy of shared sorrow. But sitting alone in the fading garden, she could no longer maintain the pretense. She missed him. She missed the quiet understanding in his eyes, the unexpected warmth beneath his guarded exterior, the way he had asked what she wished for, as though her own desires mattered as much as anyone else's expectations. A letter arrived 3 days later, delivered by a private messenger rather than the regular post, addressed in handwriting she did not recognize but somehow knew instantly. She waited until she was alone in her room before breaking the seal, her hands trembling slightly as she unfolded the paper. "Elinor, I find myself, against my better judgment, unable to stop thinking of our conversations by the fire, and of things I should perhaps not mention in writing at all. I trust you arrived safely at Blackmore, and that your family's demands have not proven too burdensome. Know that whatever comes next, I do not regret the days you spent beneath my roof, nor anything that passed between us there. Write to me if you are willing, if only to tell me you are well. Alastair." Elinor read the letter 3 times before folding it carefully and tucking it into the lining of her trunk, hidden from prying eyes. She should not respond, she told herself firmly. Any correspondence between them, however innocent in wording, risked exposing them both to exactly the kind of scandal neither could afford. And yet, by that evening, she had already begun composing her reply in her mind, unable to resist the pull of his words any more than she had been able to resist the pull of his presence in the fire-lit hall. Her response, when she finally wrote it, was careful and measured on the surface, though she allowed herself small honesties beneath the careful wording, admissions of how the memory of Ardgur lingered longer than she had expected, of how Blackmore's cold formality only sharpened her appreciation for the warmth she had briefly found beneath his roof. Their correspondence continued over the following weeks, letters exchanged discreetly through a trusted servant Elinor had known since childhood, each one growing slightly bolder than the last, though both remained careful never to write anything that could not survive discovery by unfriendly eyes. But secrets, however carefully guarded, rarely remained hidden forever. It was Margaret who noticed first, the way Elinor's expression softened whenever a private letter arrived, the way she disappeared to the garden immediately afterward, the faint smile she could not quite suppress despite her best efforts at composure. Margaret said nothing directly, but Elinor caught her watching with narrowed, calculating eyes on more than one occasion, and she knew, with growing unease, that her secret would not remain safe for long. The confrontation came nearly a month after Elinor's return to Blackmore, during a formal dinner attended by several of the family's closest connections. Lord Whitmore had invited a prospective suitor for Elinor's consideration, a wealthy widower named Edmund Carow, pleasant enough in manner, but utterly unremarkable in every way that mattered to her now-altered heart. "I understand you spent several days at Ardgur Castle on your journey north," Margaret said pointedly during a lull in conversation, her voice carrying just enough for the entire table to hear. "How fortunate that the Duke himself was present to offer such personal hospitality." Elinor felt every eye at the table turn toward her, and she forced herself to remain composed despite the sudden tightness in her chest. The Duke was a gracious host, as any gentleman would be under such circumstances. "Of course," Margaret said, though her tone suggested otherwise. "Though I have heard the Duke of Ardger rarely extends such hospitality to anyone, one might almost call it remarkable." "One might," Elinor agreed evenly, refusing to give her sister-in-law the satisfaction of visible discomfort, though inwardly her heart pounded with growing alarm. Lord Whitmore's expression darkened considerably, and Elinor understood with sinking certainty that this conversation would not end at the dinner table. She was proven correct within the hour, when Whitmore summoned her to his study, his expression grim. "I will not have this family's name attached to scandal," he said without preamble the moment the door closed behind her. "If there is truth to the whispers Margaret has been collecting, regarding you and the Duke of Ardger, I demand to know it now, before it becomes public knowledge and ruins whatever remains of your reputation, and by extension, this family's standing." "There is nothing improper to report," Elinor said, though the lie tasted bitter even as she spoke it. "See that it remains so," Whitmore said coldly. "You will accept Mr. Carrow's courtship, and you will do so before further rumors take root. I will not have my brother's widow become the subject of Highland gossip." Elinor left the study shaking with barely restrained anger, though beneath the anger lay something closer to fear. Fear that the fragile, precious thing growing between herself and Alasdair might be crushed before it had ever truly been allowed to breathe. She wrote to him that same night, her hand trembling as she explained the growing suspicion at Blackmore, the pressure mounting to accept Mr. Carrow's courtship, the danger that any further correspondence between them now posed to them both. His reply arrived within days, shorter than his previous letters, though no less resolute. "I will not let distance and gossip decide this for us, Elinor. Whatever must be done to protect you, I will do it. But know this, I do not intend to simply let you go." Elinor read the letter with a mixture of fear and fragile hope she had not allowed herself to feel in years. Hope that perhaps, despite every obstacle standing between them, something real and lasting might yet be possible. But even as hope bloomed cautiously in her chest, the walls of Blackmore Hall pressed in around her more tightly than ever, and Elinor understood with growing dread that the battle for her own future had only just begun. The summons to London arrived a week later, delivered not as a request, but as a demand. Lord Whitmore had arranged a formal engagement dinner with Mr. Edmund Carrow's family, insisting Elinor's presence was required to finalize what he considered an already settled matter. Elinor packed her trunk with a heavy heart, aware that refusing outright would only harden Whitmore's resolve and deepen the family's suspicions regarding Ardger. She had not expected Alasdair to follow. Yet 3 days after her arrival at the Whitmore townhouse in London, a card arrived announcing the Duke of Ardger's presence in the city, ostensibly for matters of business concerning Highland trade agreements. Elinor read the announcement in the morning paper with a mixture of alarm and helpless relief, knowing immediately that business was only part of his true purpose. They did not meet directly at first. London society was far too small, far too watchful, for a duke and a recently widowed woman to be seen together without immediate speculation. Instead, Elinor caught only glimpses of him across crowded rooms during the following days. At the opera, where his gaze found hers across the theater despite the distance. At a garden party, where he stood at the edge of the crowd, watching her with quiet, restrained longing that made her chest ache with the effort of maintaining proper distance. It was at the Whitmore's own grand ball, held specifically to formalize her engagement to Edmund Carrow, that their careful distance finally broke. Elinor stood near the edge of the ballroom, enduring Mr. Carrow's pleasant but unremarkable conversation, when she felt a familiar prickle along the back of her neck, the same awareness she had felt every time Alasdair entered a room since their first meeting. She turned, and there he was, standing near the entrance in formal evening dress, looking every inch the powerful Scottish Duke society whispered about, his gray eyes finding hers instantly across the crowded room. Lady Ashworth, he said, approaching with practiced composure once introductions allowed, though his voice carried an unmistakable warmth beneath the formal courtesy. I had not expected to find you here this evening. Nor I you, your grace, Alina replied, matching his careful tone despite the way her heart raced beneath her composed exterior. I understood you were in London on business. Business of various kinds, he said, his gaze flickering briefly toward Mr. Caro before returning to her. Might I request a dance if your evening allows? Mr. Caro, ever pleasant, offered no objection, and Alina found herself led onto the dance floor before she could properly consider the wisdom of accepting. The moment his hand settled at her waist, the moment their fingers intertwined in the formal steps of the dance, every careful resolution she had made over the past weeks seemed to dissolve entirely. You should not have come, she murmured as they moved through the steps, careful to keep her expression neutral for the watching crowd. I could not stay away, he admitted quietly. Not when I learned of this engagement dinner, not when I understood what your family intends to force upon you. It is not so simple as forcing, Alina said, though even as she spoke the words she recognized their hollowness. Mr. Caro is a decent man. The match would secure my future. Is that truly what you wish? Alasdair asked, his voice low and intent, echoing the very question he had asked her weeks before in his own castle's dining room. Alina's breath caught, and for a moment she could not answer, caught between the safety of expectation and the dangerous, exhilarating pull of honesty. No, she finally admitted, barely above a whisper, it is not what I wish at all. Something fierce and relieved flashed across Alasdair's expression, quickly masked as the dance carried them past watching eyes. Then do not accept it, he said simply. Whatever comes next, Alina, do not settle for a life you do not want out of fear alone. It is not only fear, she said. It is duty, obligation, everything I have been taught to value above my own wishes. And what of your own happiness? Alasdair pressed. Does that count for nothing in the accounting of duty and obligation? The dance ended before Alina could formulate a proper answer, and she stepped back from him with visible reluctance, aware of Margaret's sharp eyes watching from across the ballroom, aware of Mr. Caro waiting patiently near the refreshment table, aware of every careful rule she was meant to follow now threatening to unravel entirely. Thank you for the dance, Your Grace, she said formally, though her voice trembled slightly with the effort of maintaining composure. The pleasure was entirely mine, Lady Ashworth, Alasdair replied, equally formal, though his eyes held a promise that made her pulse quicken further. She did not see him again that evening, though she felt his presence throughout the remainder of the ball like a persistent, quiet pull she could not fully ignore. By the time she retired that night, exhausted from the effort of maintaining proper composure, she found a small folded note tucked discreetly into her evening gloves, delivered somehow without her notice during the crowded evening. Meet me tomorrow, 10 o'clock, the gardens behind St. James's. Come alone if you can manage it. There are things I wish to say to you that cannot be written in letters, nor spoken safely in ballrooms. Alina knew, with absolute certainty, that agreeing to such a meeting was reckless beyond anything she had risked before. A private meeting, unchaperoned between a widow and a duke not her intended, would spell absolute ruin if discovered. And yet, as she read the note again by candlelight, she knew equally certainly that she would go. The following morning, she made her excuses to Margaret. A headache, a need for fresh air, a quiet walk to clear her thoughts before the evening's continued festivities, and slipped away toward the gardens with her heart pounding every step of the way. Alasdair was waiting near a secluded bench beneath a canopy of autumn-colored trees, dressed simply, without the formal trappings of the previous evening. He rose the moment he saw her, relief evident in his expression, as though he had genuinely feared she might not come. You came, he said softly. I should not have, Alina replied, though she moved to sit beside him regardless, unable to resist the pull that had brought her here despite every risk involved. I am glad you did, regardless, Alasdair said. He took a steadying breath, and Elinor sensed immediately that whatever he intended to say carried significant weight. "Elinor, I did not come to London simply for business, nor simply to see you dance with another man at a ball meant to celebrate his claim upon you. I came because I could not bear the thought of losing you to a life neither of us truly wants, without at least attempting to fight for something different." Elinor's heart pounded fiercely. "Alasdair." "Let me finish," he said gently. "I know what I ask carries enormous risk, to your reputation, to my own standing, to everything both of us have carefully built in the aftermath of our respective griefs. I do not offer this lightly. But I find myself, for the first time in 4 years, genuinely hopeful about a future I had long since abandoned believing in. And I do not wish to face that future without you beside me, if you are willing to risk it as well." Elinor felt tears gathering unexpectedly in her eyes, overwhelmed by the sincerity in his voice, the vulnerability he had allowed himself despite every guarded instinct she knew he carried. "The scandal alone could ruin us both," she whispered. "My family would never forgive it." "Society would. Society's judgment has never once brought either of us genuine happiness," Alasdair interrupted gently. "I am not asking you to decide this instant, Elinor. I am simply asking you to consider it, truly consider it, without the weight of obligation clouding your judgment. Consider what you would choose if fear and duty were not standing in your way." Elinor sat in silence for a long moment, the autumn wind rustling softly through the trees above them, the weight of his words settling deeply into her heart. She thought of Charles, gone 3 years now, and the quiet, dutiful grief she had carried faithfully in his memory. She thought of Blackmore Hall's cold formality, of Whitmore's calculating demands, of Mr. Caro's pleasant but unremarkable presence, offering safety without any real warmth. And she thought of Alasdair, of storm-gray eyes and quiet understanding, of a kiss shared in firelight that had changed something fundamental within her, of a man who had asked, twice now, what she truly wished for, rather than simply what duty demanded of her. "I need time," she said finally, her voice unsteady but honest. "This is not a decision I can make carelessly, Alasdair, however much my heart may already be leaning toward you." Relief and understanding flickered across his expression in equal measure. "Then take whatever time you need," he said gently. "I will not press you further than you are ready for. But know this, Elinor, I do not intend to simply disappear from your life, regardless of what you ultimately decide." Elinor left the garden that morning with her heart in turmoil, torn between fear and hope, duty and desire, the careful, expected path laid out before her, and the uncertain, dangerous, exhilarating possibility Alasdair had offered instead. She did not yet know which path she would choose, but for the first time since Charles's death, she understood with quiet, startling clarity that the choice was genuinely her own to make. The confrontation Elinor had long feared arrived sooner than she expected, and far more publicly than she could have imagined. 2 days after the garden meeting, a gossip column appeared in one of London's most widely read society papers, hinting, without naming names directly, though the description left little doubt, at a scandalous connection between a certain reclusive Scottish duke and a recently widowed lady currently residing with her late husband's family in the city. Elinor read the column with a sinking heart over breakfast, her hands trembling slightly as Margaret watched her reaction with poorly concealed satisfaction from across the table. "How very unfortunate," Margaret said, her tone dripping with false sympathy, "that such rumors should circulate just as your engagement to Mr. Caro approaches formal announcement. I do hope, for the family's sake, there is no truth to them whatsoever." Lord Whitmore's fury when he learned of the column was immediate and absolute. He summoned Elinor to his study within the hour, his face flushed with barely restrained anger. "Explain this," he demanded, throwing the offending newspaper onto his desk. "Explain how such a scandal comes to print, naming details only someone within this household could have provided." "I have done nothing to warrant such rumors," Elinor said, though her voice lacked its usual steadiness. "Nothing?" Whitmore's voice rose sharply. "You danced with the man at your own engagement ball, Elinor. You were seen leaving the house alone yesterday morning, absent for over an hour with no adequate explanation. Do you take me for a fool?" Elinor said nothing, unable to deny the truth of his accusations without resorting to outright lies. She found herself unwilling to tell. "I will not have this family's reputation destroyed by your recklessness," Whitmore continued, his voice cold with fury. "You will marry Mr. Caro within the month, and you will end whatever foolish connection you have formed with the Duke of Ardgour immediately. If you refuse, I will ensure every door in London society closes to you permanently, and I will see to it that whatever remains of your inheritance is withheld entirely." Elinor left the study shaking, the weight of Whitmore's threat settling heavily over her chest. She understood, with painful clarity, that her family held far more power over her future than she had allowed herself to fully acknowledge, power that could crush both her reputation and her financial security if she dared defy their demands. She wrote to Alasdair that same evening, explaining the scandal, the newspaper column, Whitmore's furious ultimatum. Her hand shook as she described the impossible choice now before her, between the safety of an arranged marriage that would protect her from further ruin, and the uncertain, dangerous path toward a future with a man society had already begun condemning them both for daring to consider. His reply arrived within hours, carried by a private messenger rather than the regular post, his handwriting hurried but resolute. "Elinor, I will not allow your family to threaten you into a marriage you do not want, nor will I hide from whatever scandal our connection has caused. Meet me tomorrow at midday at the address enclosed. There is something I must discuss with you directly, something that cannot wait any longer." The address led to a modest townhouse Elinor did not recognize, situated in a quieter part of the city away from the fashionable districts where London society typically gathered. She arrived nervously, uncertain what awaited her, and found Alasdair waiting inside, his expression grave but determined. "I have spoken with my solicitors this morning," he said without preamble, once the door had closed behind them. "And I have made a decision I hope, sincerely, that you will consider carefully before rejecting outright." "What decision?" Elinor asked, her heart pounding with a mixture of apprehension and cautious hope. "Marry me," Alasdair said simply, the words landing with unexpected weight despite their directness. "Not out of obligation, nor to silence scandal, though I recognize it would certainly accomplish that, but because I have spent every day since you left Ardgour Castle certain that my future holds far more meaning with you in it than without you." Elinor stared at him, speechless for a long moment, torn between overwhelming joy and equally overwhelming fear. "Alasdair, my family will never consent. Whitmore has already threatened to withhold my inheritance entirely, if I do not marry Mr. Caro as arranged." "Then let him withhold it," Alasdair said firmly. "I have more than sufficient means to provide for you, Elinor, without any dependence whatsoever on your late husband's family fortune. Whatever they threaten to take from you, I promise you will want for nothing as my wife." "It is not only the money," Elinor said, though she felt her resolve weakening rapidly beneath the sincerity in his voice. "It is the scandal itself. Marrying so soon after these rumors, so soon after my husband's family formally arranged another match, society will never forgive it. We will be shunned, whispered about, excluded from every respectable gathering for years to come." "Perhaps," Alasdair acknowledged, "though I have found in recent weeks that I care considerably less about society's judgment than I once believed myself capable of. What I care about, Elinor, is whether you are willing to risk that judgment alongside me, for the sake of a genuine chance at happiness neither of us expected to find again." Elinor felt tears gathering in her eyes, overwhelmed by the enormity of the choice before her. She thought of Charles, of the quiet, dutiful years of mourning she had faithfully observed in his memory. She thought of Blackmore Hall's cold formality, of Whitmore's calculating threats, of the safe, unremarkable future Mr. Caro represented. And she thought of Alasdair, of storm-gray eyes and quiet understanding, of fire-lit conversations and stolen kisses, of a man who had asked, again and again, what she truly wished for. "If I choose you," she said slowly, her voice trembling with the weight of the decision forming within her. "I lose everything my family has ever offered me. My standing, my security, whatever remains of my late husband's legacy." "And if you choose safety instead," Alasdair replied gently, "you may gain security, but I fear you will lose something far more valuable in the process. The chance to build a life genuinely your own, chosen freely rather than forced upon you by others' expectations." Elinor closed her eyes, feeling the full weight of 3 years of careful duty, and quiet grief pressing against the fragile, exhilarating possibility of choosing something different entirely. When she opened them again, she found Alasdair watching her with a patience that somehow made the decision feel less impossible than it had moments before. "I need to speak with Whitmore directly," she said finally. "I owe him that much honesty whatever I ultimately decide, but Alasdair," she paused, drawing a steadying breath, "I believe my answer is yes. Regardless of what it costs me, I believe my answer has been yes since the moment I first knocked on your door in that storm." Relief and joy broke across Alasdair's expression, quickly followed by fierce determination. "Then whatever Whitmore says, whatever scandal follows, I promise you will not face it alone." Elinor returned to Blackmore's townhouse that afternoon with her heart pounding, uncertain exactly how the coming confrontation would unfold, but resolved, for the first time in 3 long years, to choose her own future rather than simply accepting whatever future others deemed appropriate for her. She found Whitmore waiting in his study, his expression already dark with suspicion, as though he somehow sensed the shift that had occurred within her over the course of the day. "Well," he demanded the moment she entered, "have you come to your senses regarding Mr. Caro, or must I take more drastic measures to secure this family's reputation?" Elinor straightened her shoulders, drawing on a strength she had not fully recognized within herself until this precise moment. "I have come to inform you, Lord Whitmore, that I will not be marrying Mr. Caro. I intend instead to accept the Duke of Ardger's proposal of marriage." Whitmore's face flushed dark red with fury. "You dare defy me, after everything this family has provided for you these past 3 years. "I have honored my obligations to this family faithfully since Charles's death," Elinor replied, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart. "But I will not sacrifice my own happiness indefinitely simply to preserve appearances that matter more to you than they have ever mattered to me." "Then you forfeit everything," Whitmore said coldly. "Every claim to your husband's remaining fortune, every connection this family has provided, every door that family name has ever opened for you." "I understand the cost," Elinor said quietly, though her voice did not waver, "and I accept it willingly." She left Whitmore's study that evening with nothing but the clothes in her trunk and the fragile, hard-won certainty that she had finally chosen a path genuinely her own, uncertain of exactly what awaited her, but resolved, at last, to face it without regret. News of Elinor's broken engagement and her intended marriage to the Duke of Ardger spread through London society within days, exactly as swiftly and viciously as she had feared. Invitations to fashionable gatherings dried up almost overnight, replaced instead by whispered conversations that stopped abruptly whenever she entered a room, and pointed glances from women who had once counted themselves among her acquaintances. Catherine, upon learning the news, sent a single scathing letter accusing Elinor of deliberately scheming to steal Alasdair's affections since the very night of the storm. A letter Elinor read once, felt the sting of, and then set aside, refusing to let its cruelty diminish the certainty she had finally found in her own choice. Alasdair, for his part, remained steady throughout the growing scandal, arranging their wedding quietly but without any pretense of hiding, determined that they would face society's judgment honestly rather than through concealment or apology. They were married within 3 weeks, in a small ceremony attended only by a handful of trusted friends and Alasdair's loyal household staff, far removed from the grand society weddings Elinor might once have expected for herself. The journey back to Ardger Castle as Alasdair's wife felt entirely different from her first desperate arrival during that violent storm months before. The mountains rose around them in the golden light of early winter, And for the first time since Charles's death, Elinor felt genuinely, wholly at peace with the direction her life had taken. Yet peace did not mean the absence of difficulty. The scandal followed them even to the Highlands, in the form of pointed letters from distant relations, in the coolness of certain neighboring families who had once counted Alasdair among their closest connections. Fiona reported, with careful diplomacy, that several long-time household staff had expressed private discomfort at the speed and circumstances of the marriage, though none dared voice such concerns directly to the Duke himself. "Do you regret it?" Alasdair asked one evening, several weeks into their marriage, as they sat together in the great hall where their story had truly begun. "The scandal, the isolation from society, the loss of your family's support. I would understand if some part of you wished things had unfolded differently." Elinor considered the question seriously before answering, unwilling to offer empty reassurance where honesty was warranted. "There are moments," she admitted, "when the isolation weighs heavily, when I think of the family I have lost, however imperfect our relationship truly was. But no, Alasdair, I do not regret my choice, not when I consider the alternative." "And what alternative is that?" he asked quietly. "A safe, comfortable life with a man I could never truly love," Elinor said, "versus an uncertain, sometimes difficult life with a man I love completely. I know now which choice I could have lived with, and which would have slowly hollowed me out from the inside over years of quiet, dutiful unhappiness." Alasdair reached for her hand, and Elinor felt the same warmth she had first noticed months before, though it had deepened considerably since then, tempered by genuine partnership rather than simply the exciting uncertainty of new attraction. Over the following months, the sharpest edges of the scandal gradually began to soften, as scandals inevitably do when new gossip arrives to distract society's attention elsewhere. Some connections remained permanently severed. Elinor's relationship with Whitmore and Margaret never recovered, and she made her peace slowly with that particular loss. But others surprised her. Distant cousins who wrote quietly supportive letters, old friends who visited despite the risk to their own reputations, tenants and neighbors throughout Ardgour's lands who judged Alasdair and Elinor far less by London's harsh standards than by the genuine kindness and fairness they demonstrated in their daily conduct. Catherine and Lord Grant eventually settled their own ambitions elsewhere, Catherine marrying within the year to a wealthy baron whose estate, though smaller than Ardgour's, apparently satisfied her considerably once the sting of rejection had faded. Elinor felt no lingering animosity toward her, only quiet relief that whatever bitterness had passed between them had not proven permanent. As winter deepened into spring, Elinor found herself increasingly at ease within Ardgour's walls, no longer merely a grateful guest sheltering from a storm, but genuinely, fully the mistress of a home she had come to love as deeply as the man who shared it with her. She oversaw improvements to the castle's neglected gardens, worked alongside Fiona to modernize certain outdated household practices, and slowly earned the genuine respect and affection of a staff who had initially regarded her arrival with understandable wariness. Alasdair, too, changed visibly over those months, the restless, guarded grief that had once defined him gradually giving way to a quieter, steadier contentment. He laughed more easily, Elinor noticed, and the sleepless pacing that had once echoed through the castle's stone corridors grew increasingly rare, replaced instead by peaceful nights spent simply beside her. "I used to believe," he told her one evening, nearly a year after their first meeting, as they walked together through the castle's renewed gardens, "that happiness of this kind was something reserved for a life I had already lived and lost. I did not expect to find it again, certainly not so unexpectedly, and certainly not through a broken carriage wheel on a stormy night." "Nor did I," Elinor admitted, smiling as she recalled that first desperate, exhausted knock upon his castle door. "I came to Ardgour intending only to survive a difficult journey. I never imagined I would find, instead, an entirely new life waiting for me." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the last light of evening settle golden over the mountains that had witnessed the entire unlikely beginning of their story. From that first forbidden kiss beneath the ancient archway, through scandal and separation, and the difficult, courageous choice to defy every expectation placed upon them. To this quiet, hard-won peace they had built together against considerable odds. Society's judgment had not entirely faded, and likely never would completely. Some doors remained closed to them permanently, some relationships never fully repaired. But standing there together, beneath the same archway where their story had first taken its dangerous, irreversible turn, Alina understood with quiet certainty that nothing about the scandal, the loss, or the difficulty they had weathered had truly diminished what they had found in each other. Nothing about their circumstances had changed in the way the world might have expected. No grand vindication, no sudden acceptance from those who had judged them harshly, no magical erasure of the genuine costs their choice had demanded. And yet everything that truly mattered between them had changed completely, deepening from an unexpected spark of connection into something steady, real, and entirely their own. "Nothing was ever the same after that storm," Alasdair said softly, echoing thoughts Alina had long carried privately in her own heart. "No," she agreed, leaning into him as the evening settled peacefully around them. "Nothing ever was, and I would not wish it otherwise, not for anything the old life could have offered me instead." The mountains stood silent witness around them, as they always had, indifferent to scandal or society's judgment, holding within their ancient stone the quiet, enduring proof that some connections, however forbidden their beginning, prove strong enough to weather whatever storms follow. 3 years passed, and Ardgour Castle no longer felt like the cold, guarded fortress Alina had first stumbled into during that violent storm. Children's laughter now echoed through corridors that had once known only silence and grief. Alina and Alasdair welcomed a daughter first, named Fiona in honor of the housekeeper who had shown such quiet kindness during those uncertain early days, followed a year later by a son who inherited his father's storm-gray eyes and his mother's stubborn, determined spirit. The scandal that had once threatened to define them entirely had long since faded into little more than a distant memory, overtaken by newer gossip, and the simple, undeniable evidence of a marriage that had only grown stronger with time. Even certain distant relations who had once shunned Alina's choice found their way back into cautious correspondence, drawn by curiosity or perhaps genuine reconciliation. Once enough years had softened old wounds. Whitmore never fully forgave her defiance, and Alina made peace with that particular loss long ago, understanding that some bridges, once burned, simply could not be rebuilt regardless of how much time passed. But she found she no longer needed his approval to feel secure in the life she had chosen. Blackmore Hall's cold formality had long since faded into a distant memory, replaced entirely by the warmth of a home genuinely built on mutual respect and hard-won love. Catherine, surprisingly, became an unexpected source of reconciliation. She wrote to Alina several years after her own marriage, offering a genuine, if slightly awkward, apology for her earlier cruelty, admitting that time and her own happiness had softened whatever bitterness she had once carried. Alina accepted the apology graciously, understanding all too well how fear and uncertainty could drive even good people toward unkindness they later regretted. Alasdair's household, once wary of the hasty circumstances surrounding his marriage, had long since come to regard Alina not merely as their duke's wife, but as the genuine heart of Ardgour itself. She had transformed the castle's gardens into something vibrant and alive, established a small school for the local tenant children, and earned a reputation throughout the surrounding villages for fairness and genuine care that extended well beyond what duty alone would have demanded. On quiet evenings, when the children had finally settled to sleep, and the castle grew peaceful around them, Alina and Alasdair often found themselves once more in the great hall where their story had first taken its dangerous turn, sitting together beside the fire exactly as they had that first uncertain night. "Do you ever think of that storm?" Alina asked one such evening, watching the flames dance and shift much as they had years before. "Often," Alasdair admitted, smiling as he pulled her closer against his side. "I think of how close I came to simply turning you away at the door, too consumed by my own grief to recognize what waited on the other side of that decision. You never would have turned us away, Elinor said, laughing softly. Whatever your reputation suggested, I saw the truth of your character from that very first night. Perhaps, Alasdair conceded. Though I confess, I did not fully understand my own heart until considerably later than you apparently did. Elinor smiled, resting her head against his shoulder as the fire crackled softly before them. She thought of everything they had weathered together: the scandal, the estrangement from her late husband's family, the difficult early months of building a genuine partnership from what had begun as forbidden, stolen moments neither of them had planned nor entirely understood. She thought of how far they had traveled from that first desperate knock upon his door, through every obstacle society had placed before them, to this quiet, settled peace they now shared. Nothing about the world's judgment had truly changed, not in the grand, dramatic sense some might have imagined possible. Certain doors remained permanently closed, certain relationships never fully mended. The scandal that had once threatened to define them both had left permanent marks upon their respective reputations, marks that time had softened but never entirely erased. And yet everything that truly mattered had changed completely, transforming two grieving, guarded souls into a genuine, thriving family built on choices made freely rather than obligations accepted reluctantly. The forbidden kiss that had once seemed capable of destroying everything they valued had instead become the quiet, courageous beginning of everything they now cherished most. Outside, the Highland wind continued its ancient, restless song against the castle walls, much as it had that very first stormy night. But within Ardger's warm, fire-lit halls, Elinor and Alasdair remained exactly where they had always belonged, together, steady and entirely at peace with the unlikely, forbidden beginning that had brought them, against every expectation, to this quiet, hard-won happiness they now called home.